Everybody, and welcome to this webinar on this cold Melbourne day. If we've not met yet, my name is Daisy Morris, and I, alongside Professor Helena Teed, will be talking you through today merit, power, and imposter syndrome. Helena will jump on momentarily, and she will do our acknowledgement of country. But while we are waiting, maybe just have a think in your life how these concepts may have affected you. Past, present, how you anticipate they'll affect you, because this is true for everybody in varying degrees, and so it'll be good for you to personalize that and really take away some really practical tips today. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a psychologist by profession. I'm not currently registered at the moment, so legally cannot put the ist at the end, but I've paid for the degree. I worked as a psychologist, and I'm currently doing my PhD at MICRE, which is Monash Centre for Health Implementation Research, and Helena Teed is my primary supervisor. So I'm not a medical professional by the traditional definition. I am in allied health and primarily psychs. We work independently, so it's been a bit of a learning curve coming into the Faculty of Medicine and learning all about the wonderful world of that side of health. And I'm doing my PhD on imposter syndrome specifically, a bit of a buzzword, especially for women and healthcare professionals. I'm about a year and a half in, so I've scoped the literature, and that's what's gone. What is to come is now doing something with it. How do we make a difference? How do we promote women in leadership? How do we encourage women to achieve all that they want to achieve? And so that's what I'm going to be talking about at the end of today. And Helena will carry the primary first section, and she'll speak to merit and power. She's very academic and very skilled, so I'm sure she'll interweave imposter syndrome and how that directly relates to all of your lives. And so we look forward to hearing what she has to say on those things. I've heard her speak a lot on it, and it's groundbreaking thought concepts, and that really make a difference to how we think about ourselves, how we think about work, how we think about our contexts, and how that ultimately impacts outcomes. So some of you that might be for patients, some of you that might be research, but yes, has really tangible outcomes. Just give it a few more minutes to hear from Helena, but maybe if you take notes, get your notes out and answer some reflective questions on how this sits in your life, past, present, and future.
As you said, we're going to talk to you today about leadership, merit, bias, and privilege. And Daisy is going to speak to you a bit about imposter syndrome, and she's doing that from her sickbed from having a dose of COVID. So welcome and thank you all for joining us today. We're going to talk in this area from the background of actually quite an extensive body of research funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council with 2 consecutive partnership grants, and by our partners in the Advancing Women in Healthcare Leadership Initiative, and also in the Partnership Centre for Gender Equality. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that do an acknowledgement of country around acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, but also on the lands of the traditional owners on where you are all placed around Australia today when you welcome us. In my case, that's the Burrong people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to any Indigenous people joining us today. Maybe we can get this too. There we go. So the discussion we're going to have today is in the context of understanding that many of us experience challenges around bias in the workplace and potentially feeling disempowered, different degrees of privilege and of merit. Often we experience those issues at an individual level, and there are many contributors, which we'll talk about shortly. However, they are very much subject to the environment in which we work. So as an individual, and you can see this up in the top left-hand corner here, we may have a certain experience in an individual context, but that is very much determined by the culture and the environment within the organisation in which we work. and also the culture of the organisation and the social context in which we are operating as individuals, but also in which our organisations are operating. So, for example, someone who's a recent immigrant, whose English is not primary language, who has a different skin colour, a different educational background, a different cultural background to many of us, maybe working, for example, maybe identifies as a woman and maybe working in an organisation that is primarily male-dominated, that has a very Caucasian or white-based culture, where many of those challenges are really, there are many differences. And that might be a completely different experience at an individual level to what it is for someone who has the privilege of being an English speaker, having been born in the country, being culturally well assimilated, being of the predominant gender in that organisation, and being much more comfortable and potentially being attributed to as having more merit and being more empowered in that same organisational context, potentially with the same training and skills. And one of the things I'd like to all of you to consider today is the fact that an individual may experience things very differently, which are not just related to their skills and their ability, but is primarily related to the cultural context of their organisation and that broader social context in which they're operating in. And yet we very much bring many of our experiences at work down to that level of individual merit, individual power, and bias as being against the individual, whereas it's really a system ingrained issue. And the reason that's important to understand is that when you go to do any sort of training, professional development, for example, you may acquire knowledge, you may acquire skills in a program like this, or in our Emerging Leaders Fellows program, where we do leadership development training. But just giving you skills and knowledge doesn't overcome the factors that we've just talked about, and therefore can often impact on motivation, the desire to, the incentives, the willingness, the encouragement, the openness of the environment that you're in to actually give you the opportunity to use those abilities and skills fairly. And then the actual opportunity itself. Do we have equal, equivalent, appropriate opportunities that consider bias and merit and privilege when we're actually creating that? And the ability is one thing, which often sits at an individual level, but the motivation and the opportunity for us all to have an equal opportunity in the workplace to promote our careers and to have an impact and to make a difference is very much dependent on those more organisational factors and broader social context. So that's just a framing for what we're going to be able to talk about today. So if you can forgive me, I'm going to take you on a little bit of my own personal career journey when I talk about these issues, because that was the lens in which I first discovered them, if you like. So I am a clinician, I'm an academic, I hold an L3 NHMRC fellowship and juggle those things. And I also have a family. So my life has always been pretty busy. But I think one of the critical differences in my career journey was that fairly early on I was tapped on the shoulder to do an exec MBA. And it's not a normal thing that we do in academia or research. It's definitely not a normal thing we do in healthcare. And I would have loved to say no, but I was a people pleaser. So given it was the senior person who tapped me on the shoulder, I said yes. In that journey of understanding leadership and development, and I suppose a lot of other aspects often focused on ourselves as individuals, one of the things that became very clear to me was that a lot more of this was reflected in my organisation and context. And because I'm both an academic and a clinician, and I was working in not-for-profit, you actually often have different frames of merit, bias and privilege and influence in each one of the different roles that you have. But it became increasingly clear that it was not just about my personal journey, but about the context in which I was in. So I'm going to take you a little bit on that sort of journey, addressing those key things we talked about. So for a lot of people, as the majority of you, I imagine, are in academia, you would have taken that journey through life where you undertake your school education. And it is fair to say that for the better part in Australia, school level education is actually reasonably equitable, other than our major private public domain in terms of schooling. But in terms of things like gender, in fact, girls often do better in school than our male counterparts, who actually often mature a little bit later and often struggle with the structure of school at that particular adolescent life stage. But essentially, many of us do that, and then we go on to undergraduate education. as I will talk about shortly, Australia has among the most educated women in the world, and actually women are more educated at a tertiary level than men are. So in many ways, that's a reasonably equitable system to work through. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's reasonably equitable. One of the big things that changes is once we get out into the work environment, and depending on what sector we're actually working in. So in my career journey, these were the little distractions that came along the way. This little one in the top left here is now a qualified economist, a little bit older than she was then. And whilst she looked incredibly cute with chubby cheeks and, in fact, ringlets behind her head there, when she was tiny, she was quite a handful, had those little devil horns underneath that fairy and Shrek hat she's got on there. And whilst being a mother was an amazing privilege, opportunity, something I would never, ever have sacrificed for my career. One of the things that I did really struggle with when I had my children was the assumption that I had chosen to have a family, therefore I did not have the same, I was going to work part-time, therefore I didn't have the same merit in terms of even though I had the same credentials as others, I didn't have the same merit or credibility in the workplace as others. I also was really struck by the limitation on my capacity to do my job in the same way that I had done previously, and also by the incredible guilt that people often struggle with, whether you have children or don't, whether you plan to have them or not. We all have other demands in our lives. And the reality is in Australia, whether it's managing a house, managing family, managing pets, managing partnerships, or having children, there are factors that have profound influence on our career journey and often on our role and our self-perception and our organisation's perception of us and our societal perception of us, which often then reflects back on how our career journey unfolds. And so often it feels much more like this many times when we're dealing with many struggles, not just children, but other struggles in life where we're trying to also undertake our career. And so one of the reasons for that is around the fact that capacity is really a major limitation for many people. That capacity can be, is often, or we know, is actually quite differentially experienced. So you can have a scenario where we know in Australia, and this varies across different cultural groups, but in Australia we know that about 80% of the burden of running a household and running a family, and even a 10% higher in the workplace of the sort of management of logistics in a workplace is actually primarily taken on board by women. And this has been very much a social framing for quite some time. So what you tend to find is that women will be balancing career, family, again, not just children, that's extended family, aging parents, the broader context, even managing the pet in the family and the partner in the family. So what you end up seeing is for many women, although less so for the current younger generation, there was much less capacity for women to put into their careers. And this is really affected by frames like, for example, COVID. So during COVID, I'll just give you a bit of an anecdote around the fact that there were many people who were locked down, and I don't know how many of you are online who were from Melbourne during that time, but Melbourne was officially the most locked down city in the world. And what we saw in that context is we often saw that women would just automatically take the mantle of being the person who runs the house, the person who manages the logistics, the person who manages the family, again, extended family or their own family. And that was so much to the case where pretty much most mums were sitting at the kitchen table doing homeschooling with kids, and most partners were either at work or in the study pursuing their careers. And in fact, if you look at academia, where most of you are from, what we saw is that men during COVID actually dramatically improved their productivity and outputs of publications and grants, and women significantly declined their productivity because they took on all these other roles. They took carers leave, they took annual leave, they tried to juggle pretending they could do everything, and actually had far less capacity, in part because the societal expectation and the internal expectation for many women is they just step up and do it, not necessarily because they were expected to do so by their male partner. And indeed, I challenged at least my team to think differently and to really have some honest and open discussions with their families and their partners about this. And with one exception, all of them ended up with quite different arrangements where some of the carers leave, some of the annual leave, some of the study time, some of the burden was shared in all those scenarios simply by reframing. And one of the biggest problems there is that often we become our worst enemies and assume that we should be the people taking up that challenge to do everything, and left with not much capacity to do that. And so what we find is that for the majority, and this is especially when you get to more senior levels, is that often for our male colleagues, they will go to work, often not carrying much of the family, the mental clutter, the home burden, and actually will continue to ascend the career ladder. And we've got good evidence for this, whereas the woman in the traditional family unit often takes the emotional and mental clutter of organising everything at home, whether that's whatever the home environment looks like, and having gaps in their career, which really does limit their capacity. That limiting capacity often influences the way people, including the women in the workforce and others, think about their ability or their merit to actually undertake their job. And this is because this is actually a pictorial description of Australian women overall in our community, even in the current day. So we have one of the most expensive childcare systems in the world. We also have one of the highest minimum wages in the world, which is wonderful, but it means that getting help at home is really tough. Most of my colleagues who live in Scandinavia or many European countries get good government subsidised childcare, for example, or good government subsidised assistance. Or if you live in places like the US, which many of us would not necessarily want to live in, but where there is affordable home help, many of my colleagues actually have quite significant home help if they're professionals. But what we see in Australia is most of the challenges of managing a home currently are managed by women primarily, and very few of the less frequent challenges at home are actually managed by men. Now, this is shifting, and it's shifting fast, and it's actually shifting because many young women are waking up and saying, no, this is a partnership. We're working, you're working, we need to work through this. But traditionally, this has been what it looks like. And so, as I mentioned, in Australia, we have a very significant disparate tertiary education situation. So basically, women are more educated than men, much more likely to have a bachelor's degree. Whilst this, and this is World Economic Forum data, whilst this looks good, in fact, what it does is leave a disparate, quite a significant gap in terms of HECS debt. For example, if you're a male predominantly who is in trades, and it is not all men, but predominantly, you're usually paid to do your trade training, and it's at a younger age, and you come out qualified and earning a very healthy income, often more than you would get after you get a bachelor's degree at a younger age. So in terms of disposable income, we often see this problem here is now generating a debt incumbent a sector of women, and in fact our male colleagues are doing much better through the current dichotomy we're starting to see here. And this is even more marked if you start to look at postgraduate degrees. So what this results in is a very disparate income, and this is currently from the 2023, the Global Gender Gap Report, and this is Australian men versus women. And you'll see on the left here, you have no increment in that curve really at all for men when they have a family. Their income and their reflecting their career trajectory just gradually increases over time and then curtails as they get older, whereas women never really hit that attainment because right about where they would in terms of their career training and education, they're hitting those parenting years and they're shouldering that burden pretty much alone. And that's where we really need to see some very big shifts, and we've seen some policy changes. And that then results in what we see on the right, which is in Australia, you've got less full-time employed women, almost no sharing of part-time employment, and that impacts on career and also on income. So all of that is a bit of a backdrop, and I'll just highlight that got much worse over successive governments in Australia. We've actually plotted out the World Economic Forum report. This was actually the initial LNP government. This was the last Labor government in which things were pretty static, and Australia was around 10th to 20th in the world for many of the economic participation opportunity. So this is men and women within the same country relative to each other. Political empowerment, notably, we were 40th in the world. It wasn't wonderful. Under the last LNP government, you'll see that declined dramatically. And in fact, Australia, in terms of economic participation, dropped to 70th in the world, whereas we were 10th just over a decade ago. And what that really reflected was a major problem with policies and inequity in Australia. And you'll see that that's now dramatically turned around with the presence of the Greens, the Teals, and Labor, who've had a quota for women in empowered positions in policy. And that we've actually just mapped that to the 2024 data, and it's continued to improve. So this is one of the examples of where policy and external systems environment make a massive difference in the opportunity for individuals, and where you can start to see the wood for the trees, that this is not all about the ability, the merit that individuals bring to the table, because women are super well educated in this country, but it's actually often the policy environment that results in whether or not we get equitable opportunity. Now, particularly in healthcare, that's a problem. It's also an issue in health and medical research, but not quite the same. So in healthcare, you'll see that almost all of healthcare frontline delivery is female. When you get up to the most senior roles, it's quite disparate. Academia is better than this, except it's a bit more balanced at the bottom with male and female, but by the time men, beg your pardon, but by the time you get up to these senior levels, it's still quite inequitable, primarily because of that problem that we just don't have the same opportunities around, because of capacity and because of other roles in life, and therefore to get to this sort of equitable position. So one of the things about that problem of capacity is a lot of that is not about fixing it at an individual level. The capacity argument is about getting parental leave so that you can have both partners doing it, having both partners look after the pet burden, the house burden, the family burden, and that requires quite a major societal shift in understanding and acceptability. And that's part of the reason we're seeing a big pushback against long-term partnerships between men and women at the moment, because women are not prepared to take that role they've taken before, and men are often not prepared to compromise from what they grew up with. So that is requiring a really big social adjustment. But you can see that it's one of the things that it's not about the individual battle, it's actually a systems issue. And then if we come to the issue around merit and credibility as well, one of the big things that gets in the way of women's career development is about capability, and capability for women is primarily a confidence level. So what we see, and Daisy will talk to you about this towards the end of, when I get to the end of the talk, is that we see that women overall, and this is a generalisation, are nowhere near as confident in their capability in the workplace as men are. They'll usually have to have far more requirements on a PD, up to 9 or 10 out of 10 before they'll apply for a role. They won't sell themselves as positively. They'll sell everything as a team achievement rather than necessarily their leadership or their credit. One would argue that it's a much generically a really good way to lead a team, but it's not necessarily the way that traditionally we've seen hierarchical leadership and self-promotion. So the concept of a confident self-promoter succeeding is absolutely classically what we're seeing in many countries around the world at the moment, including, for example, Trump and many others, whereas actually people who are not as confident, who are more humble and have more humility and are more a team player and more collective leaders, which traditionally has fit with women, then that sort of that can be a bit of a challenge in terms of how we see merit. If we see merit as typically what we have seen for a long time in senior leadership roles, that's primarily been male, it's primarily been Caucasian, so almost always English first language. It's usually people who have had significant privilege in their life to be able to, for example, get through to tertiary education because they came from a private school, high school education. They got into university and were supported to be there. They then went on to, within family and work networks, succeed more easily. They got to go and do a fellowship in Philadelphia or a fellowship in the UK because they often had a partner who would follow them and support them to do that. So what we see is career trajectories also contribute to this whole issue of confidence. And also that lack of confidence links back to a feeling of being an imposter in a role, feeling of not being confident, not earning or deserving that role. And again, I won't talk much about that because Daisy's going to talk about it. But one of the things we do recognise in this context is that we don't objectively think about the issue of merit, bias and privilege when we're thinking about people's positions, people's ability to do a role, people's succession planning, people's opportunities. And that's because we don't objectively think about all the other factors that influence this. So we think about the wheel of power and privilege. Yes, I'm a woman, but I'm also a well-educated, privileged woman because both of my parents have remained married. So I haven't come from a home where there was a divorce. I went to a public school, but I went to a very good public school. I got my opportunity for university education. I only speak English. And in fact, I don't have the skills of many others who are multilingual, which is very useful in healthcare. I'm white. I'm actually 8th generation Australian. So in many ways, many of the things that we're looking at here around citizenship, skin colour, other genders besides male and female, language barriers, I came from a middle class background, so I haven't had to address socioeconomic issues. I've always had stable housing. I don't have mental health issues. Neurodiversity is not a challenge. So you can see that there are so many other factors that could overlay my opportunity to build my ability, my opportunity to build my capability, and my confidence that goes around that I haven't had to deal with. And in fact, arguably, the only one I've really had to deal with in here is gender. And that's only one of the factors that can influence our ability to have power, to have privilege, and to be able to make a difference and succeed in our career. And for so long, the concept of merit has been around often qualifications. So, for example, so there's the bias, as I said, if you're Caucasian, you're male, you're older, but also where you're educated, what qualifications, what experience, what opportunities you've had. And yet many of those things are beyond our control as an individual. And even the ones we think of that are within our control as an individual, such as opportunities to go on fellowships or, train in a particular specialty area or get a PhD or a postdoc somewhere, are actually not related to your capability or your capacity. They're actually often related to all these other factors that influence your opportunities to be able to compete in this context. And so that can materialize more in the way of thinking of yourself as essentially there are many people who are disadvantaged at the starting line. So if you come from a home that your parents have not remained married, if you come from a lower socioeconomic situation, if you come from a regional rural area, if you have all of those factors, any of those factors or multiple factors that we've just been talking about, you don't start from the same starting line. So if we just judge merit as literally the qualifications on the page, and if we don't understand that there are additional dimensions to merit, there is disadvantage, but there is also merit or benefit in people who bring these types of experiences to the table. So one of the best ways I've seen this dealt with is actually what happened in the Queensland government, at least before the last state election. They actually addressed merit in the academic and healthcare sector, which is very much based on privilege. They've very much based their approach to that on understanding and the perspective from what opportunities people had in their lives and therefore how that was reflected in their CV, but also understanding that if you brought any or all of those diversity factors, if you happen to come from a low socioeconomic status section, if you'd had experienced homelessness, if you have come from different diverse cultures and you've managed to get to a certain level in your career, then you actually bring diversity merit to the table. So it's almost like you get brownie points on top of the baseline merit you've been able to achieve. And that was a very, very successful framing and was actually incorporated into the employment models throughout many sectors in Queensland. And that started to see a real shift in the dial around how we see merit. So merit was not to retain privilege and bias, which it can be used in that way if you just look at things and think about things at a superficial level. Merit became something where you recognised the power and privilege that others may have come from in achieving their outcomes, but also recognised the merit of having diversity amongst those that you actually pursued and gave opportunities for and motivation to actually succeed in their career. And one of the things that we also know really helps here is leadership development training, both for the individuals who are going through this, but also for the leaders in organisations, and mentors, which make a really, really big difference to our confidence, to our understanding about these sorts of barriers that we face, so that people can not necessarily experience them just on a personal level, but also understand that they are an organisational and societal level barriers, and that we can start to navigate them more successfully and be more objective about them and have an external frame to the way we understand and navigate them, rather than just thinking it's all at a personal level. And all of that leads into our credibility in the workplace, and our credibility in academia is really influenced by career stage, by age, as well as by all of those factors that we've just talked about, that can influence the way we're seen as leaders, as senior people, as people who really can make a contribution in the workplace. And again, this links to imposter syndrome, or the way we perceive ourselves, which Daisy will talk about. So essentially, one of the things about recognising the basis for merit, unpacking and unpicking the fact that just because you have the best CV doesn't mean you have the greatest merit in achieving a role. You may have someone who is equally, if not more spectacular, who has had many more struggles behind that starting line and yet has managed to incrementally achieve more, and also brings merit in diversity to the table. It's a matter of how you frame merit, and you can frame it quite differently when you understand it objectively. It also allows you to objectively think about your own merit. When you think about often whether you've got confidence to step up in a role, or whether you're always someone who's tapped on the shoulders and sponsored and given opportunities, as opposed to actually thinking about the jobs and the positions of the roles you might want and the confidence that you might need to get there. So being able to understand there are capacity factors that affect your career, and often disproportionately, that you can then reconsider and negotiate, outsource, negotiate with your partner, family, friends, to actually address in a very objective way, and not just take your lot in life that often we've been expected to do. That often our confidence is not determined by our ability, but by those merit factors that we've talked about, by that broader organisational culture and sector culture, and also by the policy systems and environment that we're in. If we see that, when you start to experience personal episodes where you double check yourself, think you're not good enough for a role, think you don't deserve it, wonder why you're there and how you got it, you can recognise that that confidence issue comes often from those external influences, and that addressing that can often be something about checking that conversational rhetoric you have, getting the advice and support of mentors, and recognising that this is about navigating a traditional system that sits outside you, and you can learn to navigate it more confidently rather than personalising it all the time. And just recognising that to address this, we need to fix the system, not necessarily make this all about each individual who may have those multiple levels of intersectional overlay that get in the way of them fulfilling their full potential. The other thing that's actually really important when you consider merit in a position is that in academia, for example, we have traditionally looked at your technical capability. So, to get into medicine, you need to have a reasonable IQ. You need to be a bit OCD, pathologically obsessive about working hard. Otherwise, you don't get to get into medicine, let alone to survive it. Likewise, if you're an engineer, if you've done if you've done an arts degree where you need a particular aptitude, you often get into roles through academia based on your IQ or your intellectual capability. And then your outputs, for example, your grants, your publications, your PhD students, your tick box successes become the basis on which you get promotion, become the basis on which you move from a level B to a level C to a level D to a professor. And yet they are not related to your leadership capability. They are not related to actually being able to fulfill a senior role. All they really are is factors that say you are particularly good at the intellectual side of your job. But we've all met and I know many who are brilliant intellectually, but maybe on the spectrum, and are really quite poor at empathy, at emotional intelligence, at supporting a team, and as I'm going to suggest to you here, at being a leader. Because in fact, they're being judged on the wrong criteria. They're being seen to have merit in senior leadership roles because they meet metrics and produce publications and outputs. They're not being seen to have merit to be a leader and to influence in different ways based on the fact that they're exceptional at what you need in leadership. So many of us struggle, including in universities more broadly, around what leadership really is. And what we know is that leadership is essentially providing guidance, working to solutions together, creating a vision with everybody and getting them engaged, engaging with a team, setting direction together, developing strategy, communications and goals. Leadership is not just being the support person in the team. That's great, but that's not leadership. Likewise, telling everybody what to do and getting everyone to follow your pathway is also not, in terms of the most conventional framing, that sort of leadership standalone is not very effective in terms of engaging your team and in terms of building their career. So one of the problems for many sectors, including academia, is we don't really understand often what leadership is. We just think it's because you're in a senior role. And we've already talked about the challenges in academia around that. Whereas if we start to recognise the benefits of understanding what leadership is and being able to enact, and that leadership also involves that element of being inclusive. So checking your own bias and privilege, recognising that, reaching out to others around people who may have many of those intersectional disadvantages we talked about, and recognising that they have struggled to get where they get despite many of those barriers, that they're really probably even more exceptional than many others who've had that bias and privilege in the past. But then in your leadership journey, that's around how you bring all those people to the table and think not just about their ability, but also about how you motivate and give them opportunities to really contribute as part of the team. And so whilst we're not really talking about leadership today, one of the things about leadership is the opportunity to be inclusive in our own leadership and encouraging that within our organisations, but also the opportunity to recognise the impact of that style of leadership on the ability for people to see their own merit, to be able to contribute the most that they can. And so we know that for many, when leadership is about inspiration and not domination, and about cooperation, not intimidation, we often see a lot more people flourish. We see a lot more people with those intersectional barriers being able to come to the fore. And so where there is an understanding of what leadership truly is, so it's not about the most papers and the most outputs, but actually about doing that work to inspire a team. And all of you will have someone who looks up to you. All of you will be a role model to someone. All of you will have some form of leadership opportunity to be able to be aware of this sort of thing, to be aware of how the concepts of merit, credibility actually impact your opportunities and to be able to navigate them objectively, but also how it impacts others' opportunities around you and how you can help and enable and mentor and guide them to be able to see beyond those biases can be really important. The other thing is that, in fact, I'll mainly focus on that point there. So what we often experience in academia is our autocratic type of leadership styles, where you've got someone who is the boss, and they're the boss because of their outputs, and they're often someone who gives direction or has control and primarily takes credit for the work. We've all met them, we've all seen them. Our academic environment often perpetuates that. That doesn't give any space for understanding the sorts of things we've talked about today, that merit needs to be seen in the context of opportunity, and the bias will often allow us to underestimate the capability of others to contribute. Whereas people who have more of a democratic leadership style or an inclusive leadership style can often be people who are much more likely to understand those nuances, to give the time to understand that the true benefits of including diversity in career development and to understanding that around opportunity and motivation. And I think that's when we start to see true transformation, when people can actually move towards being someone who can inspire, engage and enable people no matter what the background and intersectional overlay they've had. So in my particular case, I had the fortune of doing that exec MBA, and I came out of that program after 18 months, and I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. What I'd like to ask you all now was a question that was asked of me when I got to the end of my leadership development program. And I'd like you to use the to chat as much as you can. I'm pretty sure I can. Yes, I can see your chat comments. I would like you to just give me a gut reaction, and only a gut reaction, to the question of whether or not you aspire to have power in your career. That was a question the facilitator asked me at the end of the Exec MBA. Did I aspire to have power in my career? So if someone said that to you, what would you say? You just put a yes or no in the box, chat box. So you can see that there's a fantastic mix of responses. So I can tell you that my gut visceral reaction was a no with multiple exclamation marks. When I was asked originally on the basis that your gut reaction, Melissa, that was what mine was, no. Because to me, power was domination, command, and control. But there are others of you who've seen it differently. So Tiffany has said power for good. Becca said depends what sort of power. Do you want to illuminate us a little bit more on that, Becca? Thanks. I've got a new message down the bottom. Yes, not power over, but power with. Beautiful. Thanks, Becca. And others like Kitty have said some power to make decisions and have influence. So the way that the facilitator then said to me, Helena, do you wish to have power? And I said, under no circumstances, I'd rather not go to work. And he asked me why, and I said, because I see it as command control. His response to that was, and he used my full name, so I knew I was in trouble, Helena Teed, what gives you the right to define power as command and control? Because often the most influential power is people who use democratic processes and who enable and support and guide and lead others, and in doing so have much more influence and impact that's much more sustained. That one conversation made a massive difference to me in terms of my long-term career, because I framed power as actually power for good. And there's someone in here who's put exactly that. If you really want to make a difference in your career, if you make any difference in your career, then you have had power, whether you like it or not, and it's often the way we frame it. So the real journey we're talking about today is when we think about merit, we need to think about it in a broader context. When we think about power, we don't just have to think about command control. We need to think about influence for good. And the other thing is, if good people who desire a democratic leadership approach to guide and support others, if we don't step up into leadership, we lead a void where the most confident, potentially the most inept, the most autocratic, powerful people actually step up. And we've seen that and the disasters that it creates all around the world recently. So it's really important to consider it that way. Now, I'm going to almost stop here because I would like to leave Daisy some time to talk to you, but I'm just going to cover a few very quick things. And just to say that what I have been able to do with that framing over my career has been very much my career I would never have done otherwise, because I understood that my merit was often something that other people perceived, and if I had the confidence, I could actually step outside that. I understood why I would want to have influence and power, and I often understood that the barriers that were there were objective and were related to my organisation or the system I was in rather than myself. And so because my purpose was to impact and influence, I spent a lot more time thinking about things differently. And I'm actually going to stop at that point, and I'm going to ask Daisy to take over here, because on the back of that, Daisy is actually going to talk to you a little bit about imposter syndrome, which she is doing a PhD on. So over to you, Daisy.
Thank you, Helena. Let me just share my screen. Is that working, Helena? Great, fabulous. So Helena has talked a lot to the broader context around power, merit, bias, and I'm going to speak specifically to imposter syndrome. There are so many things that affect you personally, your academic journey, your professional journey, and imposter syndrome is one that is quite pervasive, especially in the area of confidence. If you lack confidence, it makes massive knock-on effects, and so that is my PhD topic. So I will speak specifically to imposter syndrome, but do try and keep all Helena said as the big context. And this is a zoom in on one specific element, and I'll tie back to some of the things she raised as well. So there we go. So imposter syndrome, let's get the definition out. So it was originally theorized by Clance and Imes in 1978, and they defined it as designate an internal experience of intellectual phoniness. Webster has gone on to make that a bit more user-friendly, and they define it as a psychological condition that is characterized by persistent doubt concerning one's ability or accomplishments, accompanied by fear of being exposed as a fraud, despite evidence of one's ongoing success. So this directly speaks to confidence. It's not people who are not very good at their job or are actually in positions of leadership when they shouldn't be. This is speaking to the people that are actually very competent, which I'm assuming is most of you here today, but there's that internal voice that says, what if I don't have what it takes? What if someone's missed out and I'm actually going to be exposed and someone's going to call me out? In the literature, this is also called imposter phenomenon, fraud syndrome, imposterism, and perceived fraudulence. As imposter syndrome is the most commonly used term, I'm going to use that for this presentation. But ongoing in the research, the language is kind of changing to imposter phenomenon as to not pathologize the kind of experiences that people are feeling. So the research on whether this is a gendered phenomenon has been controversial on and off over the years, but a recent meta-analysis published in 2024 actually found women do experience imposter syndrome at a higher rate than men do. Overall, stats show about 70% of people will experience imposter syndrome at some point in their life. But women actually do experience it at a higher rate. Interestingly, in this same meta-analysis, they did some subgroup comparisons, and they found academics and academics in healthcare to have significant impact as well. So if you're a woman in healthcare and academia in a Western environment, it is likely that you have experienced imposter syndrome at a rate higher than your standard person. So have a look there at the subgroup differences, but that's just to say it's impacted by different influences or intersectionality. So if you're a woman, if you're in a different profession, if you're a different age, sexuality, it creates this complex web of biases and barriers using Helena's imagery that sets you back from the start line, sets you back in the confidence race far back compared to someone who, for example, is higher privileged and starts on the start line. So this is the current theory of imposter syndrome, as you probably know it. Our current theory is a very individual one. The onus of you having imposter syndrome is your fault at the moment. And so this is kind of the cycle that goes on. And this is where we're currently standing in the research. But the work that we're doing over with AWOL is challenging this, saying if women, if people at the start of their career, if the queer population are experiencing it at a higher rate, there has to be something contextual going on here. You cannot just say an entire group of people experience it at a higher rate, but it's all their individual faults. So we're challenging this concept and wanting to set it more in the kind of context that goes on. So Helena showed in her first slide the individual inner and outer settings. I'm a psychologist by background, so for me that's ecological levels. But if you are familiar with CIFR and those concentric circles, same applies. But it's to say that the cycle of imposter syndrome is set within interlinking circles. It's set within your context. It's set within your bias. And they will all interact in different ways, in different points of your career and your life to have an outcome on your confidence and thereby what that does with your career pathway. So if we think on an organizational level, what kind of department you're in, what your business prioritizes, your hierarchy structures, your policies around gender inclusion will all impact you. And then obviously society. What are people expecting from women? What are people expecting from you in your career at that specific stage will impact you. And obviously the kind of sexist biases that we have are also impacting women in this space as well. And so probably after this whole talk today, you're thinking, what next? What works? Helena spoke a little bit to that in one of her last slides. And at the moment, our interventions for imposter syndrome are still individual. Generally, all of the research sits at the individual level, with primarily CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, being the primary intervention that has been found to be effective. So I'm going to kind of go from CBT and take some of those core concepts to help you in your mind conceptualize how your imposter syndrome, if that's something you're experiencing, actually fits within those ecological levels. And so, in a very cringy way, so that it helps you remember it, don't believe the lies unless they end in allies. And I'm going to give you a whole bunch of allies ending words today, to help you set that voice in your head within context. So the first one is contextualize. If you are feeling that your confidence is lacking or you're being knocked down, think about how that fits in the broader picture. Think about how that fits in all the concepts that Helena brought up today, the bias, the barriers, the merit, the power. Contextualize that, put that in its levels, that it's not 100% you are not 100% the issue. So contextualize will help. For the nerds in the room, which is probably most of you, we would call that cognitive reframing. That's the evidence behind contextualizing. And then verbalize. Often what is kept the most quiet can be the most pervasive. If we talk about it, if we share, if we say, hey, I'm kind of not feeling super confident in this area, watch your colleagues come around you and say, no, you're competent, no, you're capable. Let those external voices silence the lie inside you that you don't have what it takes, that you're not good at this. And so talk to your colleagues, talk to your friends. By verbalizing it, we can kind of take some of the power away. Depersonalize. So we remember those levels. If we can take those kind of feelings out, put them out from yourself. It's not who I am. It's not my lack. It's this department. It's this specific area. So try and take the emotional sting away from you and your capability and confidence and credibility, and make that about the situation at hand. So depersonalize. Another one in the literature is visualize. So we talk about manifesting is kind of the new agey way of saying it, but visualizing where you want to be, who you want to be, your successes, and how you right now fit in that dream is really helpful. It helps create those neural patterns of, no, actually, I can do this, I have done this, and I will succeed in this. So visualize. Oh, sorry, I've opened, there we go. We still here? Yes, we are. Okay, externalize again. So that voice in your head, that it's you and that you're the one that's failing, try and externalize that imposter syndrome voice for what it is. This is imposter syndrome. This is something challenging my confidence, because we have seen that one of the biggest barriers is confidence within credibility, capacity, and capability. Capability is the confidence one, and try and externalize that for what it is. And then we have rationalize. So rationalize your thoughts. What's more likely? Have you tricked everybody around you, or actually have you worked hard to be where you are and you deserve the credit and the confidence in you to go where you want to go? Look at the pattern of behavior that has come before and has set you, and it's very unlikely that you've been plucked and thrown in this position. It's very likely that you are capable of doing this job, and let your confidence reflect that. And probably where most of you are going, specialize. So one of the things in the research that is found to decrease feelings of imposter phenomenon or syndrome is once you get good at what you want to be good at and become an expert in your area, as you specialize and grow in your career pathway, that does decrease imposter syndrome. So as you go in your career and you find your niche and you become an expert in that, that will in time decrease your imposter phenomenon. And then my last point is don't overgeneralize. One mistake is not a pattern. One success is not a fluke. Again, we need to look at our lives and try and look at our context within us, our organization and our society to see where we fit and where what's going on is impacting us and our confidence. So we're almost at 4 o'clock. So that's my little take on imposter, little take. It's quite a big deal and it does impact a lot of people, but there's my imposter syndrome coming in there. But catch yourself, see where you're getting impacted and influenced by all those levels. Back to Helena. She's come in.
Yeah, now I know why I specialise. Oh, there you go. So I believe in this format, it's hard for people to ask questions, but you can put questions in the chat if you've just got one or two very quick questions at the end. And these slides will be available also on the WHRTN website or afterwards. There goes. The webinar will be on the webinar YouTube channel by the end of the week. If any of you wish to look at that, and you can also send us some questions if you wish to. So Sarah says, the more expert you become or the more responsibilities you take on as a result of that expertise, the more likely you are. Yeah, so interestingly, Sarah, I think that's true to some extent. For some, it's opposite. But often it's because, so for example, in my case, that training in leadership development, that ability to step outside and objectively understand where these influences were coming from, allowed me to catch myself. Just the things that Davey was saying, having 3 spectacular mentors gave me an external frame to do almost all of those things there. So it can be, but it may not be. So it's really your own journey. Great, thanks. I'm glad it was useful, Vivian. And thanks, Eleanor. And Linda just reminded me, please do the evaluation. It'll only take you 2 minutes because it's important at the end. All right, guys. Thank you, Daisy. Thank you, everybody, and especially because you've done it with COVID. Yeah, Becky, there is some things published. We'll send around, or actually I might put it in the chat now, the website, which has got all the publications on a lot of this and a lot more that will be emerging shortly. But there is a really good body of evidence now emerging, and I'll just put it in the chat so you can see where we've put a lot of this and where we will put this in future. Thanks, everybody. Bye.